I was not on the train. I need to say that first because people ask. Everyone who hears any part of this asks the same question in the same tone, like the answer will resolve something for them. Were you on the last train? And when I say no, they get this look. Not pity, exactly. Something closer to confusion, like they're trying to understand why I'm still talking. The train left Broad Street Station at 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. I know the time because the departure boards was still cycling when I reached the concourse level at 5:02. The board still showed the 447 Northeastern Regional as departed in green letters. Below it, every other line read, suspended. The word just hung there on the board, in amber, over and over. Suspended, suspended, suspended. I stood in front of that board for what must have been 2 full minutes. My messenger bag cutting into my shoulder, my coffee still in my hand. The coffee was from the place on Chestnut. It was still warm. The concourse was almost empty. That was the first wrong thing. Broad Street at 5 o'clock on a Wednesday should be a flood. Thousands of people, shoulder to shoulder, pushing toward the platforms. Instead, there were maybe 40 people visible, most of them standing still like I was, looking at the board or looking at their phones or looking at each other with that particular expression. And that means someone is waiting for another person to react first. I called Dana. It went straight to voicemail. I called my mother. Same. I opened my phone browser and the page wouldn't load. I tried 3 times, and then the 4th time a partial page rendered, just the header of a news site, and the first 6 words of a headline that said Governor declares state of emergency in, and then nothing else. The rest wouldn't load. A woman near the ticket counter was crying. Not loudly. She was just standing there with tears running down her face and her hand over her mouth, and nobody was going to her. That was the second wrong thing. In a normal world, somebody goes to a crying woman in a train station. That day, nobody moved toward anybody else. We were already learning the new rules even before we knew what they were. I should say where this was, Philadelphia. I should say who I am. My name is Mara Sadowski. I was 31. I worked in medical billing at a practice on Walnut Street. I am not interesting. I am not brave. I am not the person you would write about if you were choosing someone to survive something. I am 5'4" and I have bad knees, and I was 7 months into a relationship that wasn't working, and I had not spoken to my father in 2 years. I'm telling you these things because later they became relevant in ways I didn't expect, and because I want you to understand I am not constructing myself as a hero. I was a person in a train station. And then I was a person in a city that became something else. And everything that happened after was just a sequence of decisions made with insufficient information by someone who wanted very badly to not die. The first official communication came over the station PA system at approximately 5:15. A male voice, calm, clearly reading from a script. Attention all passengers. SEPTA and Amtrak service has been temporarily suspended from this station due to a public safety advisory. Please proceed to the nearest exit in an orderly fashion. Emergency information will be available at designated points outside the station. Do not attempt to access the platforms. Thank you for your cooperation. The thing about that announcement was the word temporarily. It did so much work. It kept people from screaming. It kept the 40 of us filing up the escalator toward Market Street, with our bags and our coffees and our irritation rather than our terror temporarily, meaning this is an inconvenience, meaning someone is handling it, meaning the world outside this station is still the world you left 2 hours ago when you came to work. Market Street was wrong. I don't know how else to say it. The light was the same. The buildings were the same, but the traffic was gone. Not reduced, gone. I mean, I stood on Market Street at 5:15 on a Wednesday, and there was not a single moving vehicle between me and the river. I could see all the way down to the water. There were cars stopped. Some of them had doors open, but nothing moved. The stoplights were still cycling. Green, yellow, red, green, yellow, red, performing for no one. There were people on the sidewalks, but they were all moving in the same direction. West, away from the river, moving quickly, but not running, not yet. The running came later. At that point, everyone was walking fast, looking at their phones, not talking to each other. I fell into the current of them and walked west because everyone else was walking west. And because standing still felt like something you could die from. I think it took me 4 blocks to hear the first siren. Then several at once, layered, coming from the south. Then a helicopter. I had never heard a helicopter that low over Center City. It was close enough that I could feel the vibration in my sternum, and it was moving east, toward whatever everyone else was moving away from. I want to be honest about what I knew and when I knew it. At 5:15, I did not know.
I thought chemical spill or gas leak, or maybe a bomb threat.
Something with a name. Something where you walk 12 blocks, and then there's a perimeter, and someone in a vest tells you what happened, and you go home on a different route. At 5:15, the word zombie was not in my mind. It wasn't in anyone's mind. That word belonged to movies and games and late-night conversations that didn't matter. It had no weight. It described nothing real. By 5:45, I was at Rittenhouse Square, and the weight was beginning to settle. I had stopped at a corner where a small crowd had gathered around a man holding his phone up so others could see the screen. I pushed in close enough to see. It was a news broadcast, live streaming. The anchor was talking, but the volume was low, and I couldn't hear the words. Behind her, in the corner of the screen, was aerial footage. I recognized the skyline. It was Philadelphia. It was the area around the convention center, maybe 8 blocks from where I was standing. In the footage, there were shapes moving in the street. The resolution was poor, and the helicopter was high, but you could see them. You could see the way they moved. There was something wrong with the way they moved. The gait was too fast and too uneven at the same time, like each leg had a different intention. And there were a lot of them. More than I could count on the small screen. Dozens at minimum, maybe more. The man holding the phone said, without looking away from it, "They're saying it came from Jefferson." The ER, nobody responded. We all stood there and watched the small screen and the shapes on it, and I remember that the trees in Rittenhouse were moving slightly in the wind, and the evening light was golden. The way it gets in September, and a dog was barking somewhere behind us, and the world was still the world, except it was not. I'm going to skip some time now, not because what happened between 5:45 and approximately 8 p.m. doesn't matter, but because it was confused and I was confused, and some of it I've reconstructed from what other people told me afterward. And I can't be certain what's memory and what's assembly. What I know for certain is the following. I did not go to my apartment. My apartment was on Spruce near 10th, east of where I was. East was wrong. Everything east of Broad was wrong by then. I tried to call Dana 11 times. I tried to call my mother 4 more times. I sent texts. Nothing went through after about 6 p.m. The network didn't fail all at once. It degraded. Messages would show as ascending for minutes and then fail. Then the phone just stopped connecting at all. I walked to my friend Keisha's apartment in University City because it was west and because I didn't know where else to go. The walk should have taken 20 minutes. It took over an hour because of the bridge. The South Street Bridge was packed, not with vehicles. With people, hundreds of people crossing on foot, pressed shoulder to shoulder, many of them carrying things. Bags, children, a man carrying a cat in a crate, a woman carrying a desktop computer monitor, people grabbing whatever they could and going. The bridge felt like something from a history book. An Exodus painting. I kept my head down and my bag close, and I walked. Keisha was not home. Her door was locked. The building was accessible because someone had propped the front door with a shoe. I sat in the hallway outside her apartment until almost midnight, and then a woman I'd never met came up the stairs and saw me and said, "You can't stay in the hall. Come in if you want." Her name was Trish. She lived on the 3rd floor. She had a 1-bedroom with a cat and a police scanner she'd pulled out of a closet. We sat in her living room and listened to the scanner for 6 hours. What I heard on that scanner is the thing that changed me. Not the sight of the departure board, not the empty street, not the shapes on the phone screen, the scanner. Because the scanner was where the institutional language started to fail, where the calm procedural voices started to come apart. For the first hour or so, it was structured, unit numbers, location codes. Respond to and secure the perimeter at, and be advised. The voices were professional. They were doing their jobs. They were naming streets I knew and describing a situation that had a shape, a boundary that expanded but still had edges. East of Broad, then east of 15th, then the perimeter was 20th. Then the perimeter was discussed rather than stated. Then there were no more perimeter references. Just locations, just requests for backup that no one acknowledged. Just a voice saying, "We've lost visual on the unit at 33rd and Market," and no one responding. And the voice saying it again, and then a different voice saying, "All units do not respond to calls south of Chestnut until further notice," and no explanation. Just the instruction, just the void where the reason should have been. Around 3 a.m., a voice came on the scanner that was not professional. It was a man, and he was breathing hard, and he said, "They're in the building. They came through the parking garage. There's, I don't know how many. They're on the second floor. Some of them they're still wearing their clothes. One of them is wearing scrubs. I need someone, please respond." And then nothing, static. Then the regular traffic resumed like it hadn't happened. Trish turned the scanner off after that. She said, "I think we've heard enough." She gave me a blanket and I slept on her couch for maybe 2 hours. The cat slept on my chest. I lay there and listened to the cat purr and the distant sirens. And I tried to construct a version of events that led to Dana being alive somewhere and couldn't make the story work. Her apartment was on 3rd Street, 3rd and Bainbridge, well east of everything, well inside whatever was happening. In the morning, Thursday, the TV worked. Trish had cable, and the national networks were broadcasting. I watched for 2 hours, and I'll summarize what I learned, because the broadcasts were repetitive and contradictory and carefully incomplete. A pathogen of unknown origin had created a behavioral crisis centered in several East Coast cities. Philadelphia was one of the worst affected. The pathogen caused severe neurological compromise, leading to aggressive and erratic behavior. Affected individuals should be considered extremely dangerous and non-responsive to verbal intervention. Citizens should shelter in place, avoid all contact with affected individuals, and await further instruction from local authorities. The National Guard had been deployed. A state of emergency existed in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. The president would be addressing the nation at noon. They didn't say the word, not that first morning. They used the language they'd prepared. Affected individuals, compromised persons, persons exhibiting stage 3 behavioral symptoms. Language that kept it medical, that kept it manageable, that told you it was as a crisis with a taxonomy, a system of classification, a chain of response. Not something from a movie, not something impossible. But we had the internet intermittently by Thursday afternoon, and there were videos. Everyone saw the videos. And the videos did not show behavioral symptoms. The videos showed people being eaten. The videos showed people who had been eaten getting up and eating others. The videos showed things that moved with the wrong gait and had the wrong eyes and opened their mouths in a way that was not language and not pain and not anything that belonged inside a human body, and the institutional language could not survive contact with those videos, but it tried. God, it tried for days. I stayed at Trish's through Thursday and Friday. 3 other people came. A man from the 4th floor named Dean, an older woman named Mrs. Pack from the building next door, whose daughter had driven to New York on Wednesday and not called back, and Keisha. Keisha came back on Friday morning. She'd been at her boyfriend's in Manayunk, and when she walked in and saw me on the couch, she said, "Oh, thank God." Mara and her face collapsed, and I held her, and we both cried, and it was the last time I cried for a while after that. Keisha said Manayunk was still okay. She said the bridges were the key, that the things, she used the word things, not zombies, not yet, none of us did yet, that the things had trouble with certain infrastructure. They could cross bridges, but they were slower on them, more confused. Something about the openness, the water below, the lack of walls to navigate against. She said someone in Manayunk was already talking about destroying the bridges, cutting off the neighborhoods that were elevated or surrounded by the river, making islands. That was the first time I heard the idea that would come to define the next 3 weeks. The idea of defensible space, the idea that you could draw a line and everything on your side of the line was still the world, and everything on the other side was not. By Saturday, the internet was gone for good. The TV stayed another day, and then it went to the emergency broadcast screen. That harsh tone and the colored bars and the scrolling text that said, "Shelter in place and await instruction and do not travel." And repeated. I watched that screen for an hour on Sunday morning, just the tone and the bars and the scrolling text. I think I watched it because as long as it was broadcasting, someone was still out there running it. Someone was still at a desk somewhere pushing a button. The system was still there, even if it was only capable of this one repeating message. Monday, the power went out. I want to talk about the shelter because the shelter is where most of this happened, where most of what I can't stop thinking about happened. The University of Pennsylvania opened its gymnasium complex as an emergency shelter on Thursday. The announcement went out via bullhorn trucks that drove through University City and West Philadelphia. By the time we decided to go, Monday afternoon, after the power went out, the shelter had been operating for 4 days and had developed its own rules, its own culture, its own hierarchy. We walked there. Trish, Dean, Mrs. Pack, Keisha, and me. 5 people carrying bags and blankets through streets that were mostly empty, but not entirely. You could see people in windows. You could hear generators running behind closed doors. Some businesses had been broken into. A pharmacy, a grocery store. The pharmacy door was just open, no glass broken, like someone had unlocked it deliberately. I found out later that was exactly what had happened. The pharmacist had opened it up and left a sign that said, "Take what you need," and left. I think about that sometimes. About the person who did that, whether they're alive. The gymnasium was huge. Basketball courts. The bleachers had been extended, and the floor was covered in cots. Hundreds of them in rows, with about 3 feet between each one. It smelled like a gym. Sweat and rubber and cleaning chemicals. Later, it would smell like other things, but that first day it smelled like a gym that had too many people in it. There was a check-in process. A folding table near the entrance staffed by 2 young people in Penn t-shirts. They took our names. They asked if we had any weapons. They asked if any of us had been bitten, scratched, or exposed to bodily fluids of a compromised person. They said it in that exact language, like a form, like insurance paperwork. We were assigned cots. They were in the middle of the floor, which I learned quickly was the least desirable location. The perimeter was better. Walls at your back, less foot traffic, a sense of boundary. But we were 5 days late, and the perimeter was taken. We set up in the middle and made a small cluster. 5 cots in a rough circle, bags piled between us. Keisha slept next to me, Trish on my other side. I could hear everyone breathing at night. The shelter had rules. They were posted on paper taped to the walls. No weapons on the main floor, no fires, no leaving between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. Check in with medical staff if you develop any symptoms, including fever, confusion, sudden aggression, or loss of verbal coherence. Report any suspicious behavior immediately to shelter coordinators. Water distribution at 7 a.m. and 4 p.m. Food distribution at noon. 1 meal per day. Don't waste it. The rules were maintained by a group of maybe 15 people. Some pen staff, some students, some community members, who had assumed authority early and whose authority was accepted because alternatives were worse. The de facto leader was a man named Gerald. He was maybe 55. Retired military, someone said. He didn't carry a weapon on the floor, but everyone knew he had them secured somewhere. He made announcements every morning at 7 a.m. He stood in front of us and told us what he knew, which was increasingly little, but was delivered with such steady composure that it felt like enough. The first 3 days in the shelter were manageable. Boring, even. There was nothing to do, no phones, no power except a generator that ran the lights and a single radio that Gerald controlled. We sat on our cots and talked, or we walked the perimeter of the gym floor, or we stood in line for water and food, and we waited. Everyone was waiting. The quality of the waiting changed over the course of those 3 days, from waiting for rescue to waiting for information to just waiting. But it remained the primary activity. People played cards. Someone had a chess set. Mrs. Pack folded paper cranes from the pages of a phone book someone had brought. She made hundreds of them, lines of tiny paper birds along the bleacher seats. I should talk about the sound. At night, from outside, you could hear them. Not always. Some nights were silent, but some nights there would be a sound that carried, not moaning. The movies got that wrong. It was more like a clicking, a rapid percussive sound from the throat, like someone trying to speak with a mouth full of gravel. And sometimes the sound of running, dozens of feet on pavement, at once the sound moving past the building like a river current. Those nights no one slept. We lay on our cots and listened to the feet passing, and no one said anything, and in the morning no one mentioned it. On the 4th day in the shelter, Friday, I think, something happened that I haven't told anyone about completely. I've told parts of it, I've alluded to it, but I haven't told the whole sequence because telling it requires admitting something about myself that I'm not proud of. There was a man, his name was Curtis. He'd been in the shelter since the first day, Thursday. He had a cot near the back wall, alone. He didn't talk to anyone. He was maybe 40, heavy set, wearing a Phillies t-shirt and khaki pants. I noticed him because he never got in line. Not for water, not for food. He just sat on his cot and looked at the floor. On Friday, I watched him for a long time, and I noticed that his left hand was wrapped in a t-shirt, not bandaged, just wrapped loosely in a balled-up t-shirt like he was holding it in place. I should have said something to someone. That's the thing I can't get past even now. I watched him for an entire day. I noticed the wrapped hand. I noticed the sweat on his forehead. I noticed that by Friday afternoon he was lying down and his breathing was audible from 3 cots away. And I did nothing. Because saying something meant naming what I thought was happening, and naming it meant it was real. And also because, and this is the part I'm not proud of, because his cot was at the back wall, far from mine, and I calculated the distance. I calculated it, and I decided that whatever was happening to him was far enough away from me. Saturday morning, Curtis was gone from his cot. I didn't see him leave. No one, I asked, saw him leave. His cot was empty. The t-shirt that had been on his hand lay on the floor, and there was a stain on the fabric that was dark and wrong. And I looked at it, and I looked away, and I told Keisha. I told her what I'd seen over the past day, and she looked at me, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. And then she said, "Mara, why didn't you say something yesterday?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. That night, Gerald made his evening announcement, and at the end he said, "If anyone has information about the whereabouts of a male resident, heavy set, Phillies shirt, cot 247, please come speak to me privately." His voice was exactly the same as always, calm, measured, but his eyes moved across the room differently than they usually did, faster, like he was looking for something specific. I didn't go talk to him. Another thing I didn't do. Sunday was when the shelter changed, not because of Curtis. I don't think he was the cause of what happened Sunday, at least not directly. Sunday was when they brought in the new group. Around midday, maybe 20 people arrived. They came from the east, from closer to Center City. They were escorted by 3 people with rifles, not military, just people with guns. The new group was in bad shape. Some of them were injured. A woman had a long gash across her forearm that was stitched roughly with what looked like fishing line. A teenage boy was being carried by 2 men, his leg bent at a wrong angle below the knee. They were dirty and exhausted, and most of them were crying or recently had been. Gerald met them at the entrance. There was a conversation I couldn't hear. Then he turned to the room and said, "We're taking in 22 new residents. They'll be processed through medical. Please make space in Section C." Section C was the bleachers, not the floor. The bleachers. It was the first time Gerald had separated new arrivals from the general population, and everyone noticed, and nobody said anything about it. The new group was taken through a side door to a room we couldn't see into. They were in there for 4 hours. When they came out, 3 of them were not with the group. 22 went in. 19 came out. They were directed to the bleachers. Nobody explained. Gerald did not make an announcement about it. Keisha said to me that night, whispering, "You think those 3 were bit? I don't know. What do you think they did with them?" I didn't answer. We lay there in the dark. Somewhere in the gym, someone was coughing. A dry, persistent cough that went on and on. Someone else was praying quietly. I could hear the words, but not the language. The clicking sound was outside that night, louder than before and closer. It circled the building for what felt like hours, around and around. I need to talk about day 12, because day 12 is when I became someone I don't fully recognize. By Day 12, the food was running out. Not gone? Gerald was rationing. The portions had been decreasing gradually enough that most people didn't notice from one day to the next, but I'd been watching. I paid attention to the serving sizes. It was mathematical. If the day 1 portion was 100%, by day 12, we were at maybe 4%, a scoop of canned vegetables, a quarter piece of bread. Water was still available from the tap. The water system was still functioning, pressurized by gravity from the reservoirs, not requiring power. But food was finite, and no one was coming with more. On day 12, Gerald made an announcement that a supply team would be organized, volunteers to go out into the surrounding blocks and bring back whatever could be found. He needed 6 people. He said it calmly. He said the team would go during daylight hours only. He said they would stay within a 4-block radius. He said they would be accompanied by armed escorts. He asked for volunteers. No one volunteered. He stood there in front of 400 people and asked 3 times, and no one raised a hand. And the silence in that room was the worst sound I have ever heard. Worse than the clicking. Worse than the scanner that night. The silence of 400 people. Choosing not to help, because helping meant going outside, and outside dying, and no one was willing to die for the group, including me. I sat on my cot and I looked at my hands, and I did not volunteer. Eventually 6 people were chosen. I don't know how. I don't know if they volunteered privately, or if Gerald asked them individually, or if there was some other pressure applied. They left at 8 a.m. on day 13. 5 came back at 2 p.m. with 2 grocery carts full of canned goods and bottled water and batteries and first aid supplies. The 6th, a woman, young, maybe 25, I never learned her name, did not come back. No one said what happened. The 5 who returned did not speak about it. One of them, a man with a shaved head, sat on his cot afterward and rocked back and forth for hours with his hands over his face. That night at dinner, the portions were back to what they'd been on day 8. Not full, but enough. And I ate mine, and I felt grateful, and I hated myself for feeling grateful. I want to talk about what happened with Mrs. Pack, because it's the thing that wakes me up. Not the clicking, not Curtis, not the supply team. Mrs. Pack. Mrs. Pack was 73. She had lived in Philadelphia for 40 years. Her daughter was in New York and had not called, and by day 15, Mrs. Pack had stopped asking if anyone had a phone that worked. She had stopped folding the paper cranes. She sat on her cot and she held a photograph, a small one, wallet-sized, that she kept in her pocket. I don't know who was in the photograph. I never asked. On day 16, Mrs. Pack developed a fever. She told Trish. Trish told me. We looked at each other, and neither of us said what we were thinking. We got Mrs. Pack water. We helped her lie down. We kept our voices light. The fever could be anything, a cold, stress, dehydration, the flu, fever. It was September. People get fevers in September. By day 17, the fever was high enough that Mrs. Pack was confused. She spoke in Korean, something she hadn't done since I'd known her. She spoke rapidly and looked past us at something we couldn't see, and she gripped my hand so hard the joints ached. The medical area in the shelter was a curtained-off section in the corner, staffed by a second-year medical student named Aisha, who was doing her absolute best with almost nothing. I went to Aisha and told her about Mrs. Pack, and Aisha closed her eyes and said, "Bring her over." We half-carried Mrs. Pack to the medical area. Aisha checked her temperature, 103.4, checked her eyes, checked her body for marks, for wounds, for any breach in the skin. There was nothing, no bite, no scratch, nothing. It could be anything, Aisha said, and then, quieter to me only. But I have to report it. Report it to who? Gerald, what happens when you report it? Aisha didn't answer. She looked at Mrs. Pack, who was lying on the exam table now, small and gray-haired and mumbling in Korean, and Aisha's face was the face of someone doing math they don't want to finish. "What happens?" I said again. "They'll move her to the back room." For observation. The back room. Where the three from the new group had gone. Where Curtis might have gone. The back room that no one came back from. "She doesn't have a bite," I said. "She's just sick." "I know," Aisha said. "But the protocol." "Whose protocol?" "Mara, I don't make the rules." I took Mrs. Pack back to her cot. I told Aisha I would monitor her myself. I told her the fever would break. Aisha looked at me for a long time, and then she nodded and wrote something on her clipboard and turned away. The fever did not break. It climbed through day 17 and day 18. Mrs. Pack stopped speaking entirely on day 18. She was breathing rapidly, and her skin was hot and dry, and she would not drink water, no matter how I held the cup. Trish and I took shifts sitting with her. Dean brought damp cloths. Keisha stood nearby and said nothing, and looked at Mrs. Pack, and then looked at the far wall, where the back room door was, and then looked at me. And I knew what she was thinking, and I ignored her. On the morning of day 19, Gerald came to our cluster. He stood at the foot of Mrs. Pack's cot, and he looked at her, and then he looked at me, and he said, "How long?" 3 days. Aisha told me on day 17. I said nothing. "She needs to be in the observation room, Mara. You know the rules." She wasn't bitten. She wasn't scratched. She has no exposure. We don't know what exposure looks like in every case. She's 73 years old. She has the flu. Gerald stood there. He was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He was a man holding 400 people together in a gymnasium, while the world outside turned into something else. And he had decided, early, that procedure was the only defense. That if the procedures held, they held everything. That the moment you made an exception, you lost the architecture. I understood him. I even agreed with him. But Mrs. Pack was not a procedure. She was a person who folded paper cranes and held a photograph of someone she loved and called me dear, and was dying of a fever that had nothing to do with the things outside. "You have until noon," Gerald said. "If the fever hasn't broken by noon, she goes to observation." He walked away. I sat with Mrs. Pack. I held her hand. It was so hot, it felt like holding a cup of tea. She opened her eyes once and looked at me, and I think she saw me, really saw me, clearly. And she said, in English, perfectly clear, "I'm not one of those things." And then she closed her eyes again. At noon, Gerald came back with 2 of his people. I stood up. I stood between them and Mrs. Pack's cot. I said, "Her fever is 101, Now, it's dropping. It was not dropping. It was 103.8. I lied. I lied to a man who was trying to keep 400 people alive because I could not let a 73-year-old woman with the flu die in a back room where no one ever came out. Gerald looked at me. I have thought about that look so many times. He knew I was lying. I could see that he knew. He stood there and he evaluated, not the medical situation, but me. He evaluated whether challenging my lie was worth the disruption, whether pulling a screaming woman away from a sick old lady in front of 400 scared people was worth the precedent of letting a lie stand. "I'll check again tonight," he said. And he left. Mrs. Pack died at 4:17 that afternoon. She stopped breathing while I was sitting next to her, holding the damp cloth against her forehead. One breath, and then no breath. Just silence where she had been. She did not come back. She did not change. She did not move or open her eyes or make the clicking sound. She was dead, and she stayed dead, Gutch, because she was sick and old and heartbroken. And the world she was in was not the world she could survive in, and that was all. She was a person who died of a fever in a gym, and I had been right, and being right meant nothing because she was still dead. We wrapped her in her blanket. Dean and I carried her to the back of the building where a door opened onto a loading dock. There were other bundles there, 7 of them. Some of them the same size as Mrs. Pack, some smaller. I did not look at them closely. I set her down gently and I went back inside, and I sat on my cot and I did not cry. That night I couldn't stop thinking about the back room, about the 3 from the new group, about whether they were behind that door right now, behind the walls of this same building, about what observation meant in practice, about whether Gerald was watching them or containing them, or I couldn't finish the thought. I couldn't. I became someone on day 21 who frightened me. We had a situation. A man on the far side of the gym. I didn't know his name. He was young, maybe early 20s. Came in with the second wave of arrivals. He woke up screaming. Not words, just sound. High and raw and unending. Everyone jolted awake. The lights came on. Someone hit the generator. The man was standing on his cot, arms at his sides, screaming. His eyes were open, but they were wrong. Not the wrong I'd seen in the videos, not the blankness. Something else. Something in between. Like he was seeing 2 places at once. Gerald's people were there in seconds. 4 of them with improvised weapons. Pipes, a baseball bat, they surrounded him. Gerald was shouting commands. Do not approach. Everyone stay on your cots. The man was still screaming. Then he stopped, just stopped, mid-breath, and he looked around the room, slowly, like he was counting us. And then he sat down on his cot and put his face in his hands and said, in a completely normal voice, I'm sorry. I had a nightmare. I'm sorry. Gerald's people did not stand down. They stayed around him in a semicircle. Gerald walked forward. He spoke to the man. I couldn't hear what was said. Then 2 of Gerald's people helped the man up, gently, not rough, and walked him toward the back room. The man went willingly. He was apologizing the whole way. I'm sorry, it was just a dream. I'm fine. I'm sorry. The door closed. We never saw him again. Here's what frightened me. I was relieved. When they took him away, I felt my body relax. I felt my shoulders drop. I felt safety return to the room like warm water filling a tub. And I was not the only one. I could feel the entire gymnasium exhale. 400 people watching a crying man be led into a room he would not leave, and 400 people feeling relief. That is what the shelter did to us. That is what 3 weeks of fear and confinement and insufficient information did to human beings. It made us into people who felt relief when someone was removed. It made the removal feel like hygiene, like maintenance, like the system working correctly. I think about that young man every day. I think about whether he was turning or whether he had a nightmare. I think about whether there's a difference anymore. I think about whether the back room was a quarantine or a sentence, and whether anyone in there was ever evaluated fairly, or whether observation was just the word we used so we could keep breathing. Day 26 was when Keisha left. Not left. She didn't leave the shelter. She left me. She stopped sleeping next to me. She moved her cot to the far side of the gym and joined a group of people, younger, more active, people who were talking about making a run for it, going north. Someone had heard. From where? From whom? There were no phones, no radio, no broadcasts. That north of the city was clear. That Bucks County was organized, that there were real shelters there, military, federal, with food and power and walls and order. I asked Keisha not to go. I asked her to stay. I said the words, "Please don't leave me." And I heard myself say them. And I knew they were true, but also manipulative. And I didn't know how to separate those two things. She said, "Mara, I can't stay here. You know what this place is becoming." I did know. I knew that Gerald had added 3 new rules in the past week. I knew that observation had expanded to include anyone who showed disorientation or verbal incoherence, or failure to respond to direct address. I knew that the definition of what made you suspicious was widening every day, and the definition of what made you safe was narrowing. I knew that the back room door opened more often now and that fewer people were asking about it. "Come with me," Lisa said. I can explain why, but the explanation isn't noble. It's not that I believed in the shelter. It's not that I thought Gerald's system was right. It's that outside was where the things were. Outside was where the supply team member hadn't come back. Outside was the clicking and the running feet and the shapes with the wrong gait. The shelter was bad, but it was walls and a door and a roof, and I chose walls over openness because I was afraid. That's all. I was afraid, and I chose the smaller fear. Keisha left on day 27 with 11 other people. They went at first light. Gerald didn't stop them. He watched them go from the doorway, and then he closed the door, and he looked at all of us who remained, and he said, "The perimeter is secure." Water at 7, food at noon. And that was the last time I saw Keisha. I don't know if she's alive. I have never been able to find out. That is a sentence I have said to multiple people, and it never gets easier, and it never stops being true. After Keisha left, I became very quiet, not in a way that was noticed. Everyone was quiet, but my silence was different. It was the silence of someone who has stopped participating in their own survival. I ate when food came. I drank when water came. I slept when the lights went off. I did not speak unless spoken to. I did not volunteer. I did not resist. I was a body on a cot, and I was alive because being alive required less energy than dying. This went on for, I think, 4 days, maybe 5. Time was strange. There was no daylight inside the gym. The windows were high and had been covered early on. The only markers were Gerald's announcements and the food distribution and the lights going off at night. Days lost their edges. What pulled me out was not something dramatic. It was a sound. On what I believe was day 31, late at night, lights off, I was lying on my cot, not sleeping, and I heard something I hadn't heard since the first week, a phone. Someone's phone was ringing. The ringtone was a default, that generic ascending chime. It rang 3 times and then stopped, complete silence in the gym. 400 people who had all heard it, and no one said a word. The next morning I found Trish and said, "Did you hear the phone?" "Yes." "Whose was it?" "I don't know." "Where did it come from?" Trish looked at me, and her expression was strange, not frightened, thoughtful. "I think it came from the back room," she said. "I want to be careful here. I want to tell you what happened next, without embellishing and without interpreting. I'll tell you the facts, and you can make of them what you will." Over the next 3 nights, the phone rang again, always at the same time, around 2 a.m. by my best internal estimation. Always the same ringtone, always 3 rings and then silence. It came from the direction of the back room. Other people heard it. I asked Dean. I asked 2 women from the cot row behind me. Everyone heard it. No one mentioned it during the day. No one asked Gerald about it. It existed only in the nighttime, only in whispers, only in the space between hearing something and pretending you hadn't. On the 4th night, it rang 6 times instead of 3, and on the 6th ring, someone answered it. I heard a voice, distant, muffled by walls, but unmistakably a voice, say, "Hello," and then nothing. I don't know what that means. I don't know who was in the back room with a functioning phone. I don't know who called. I don't know what was said after "Hallo," or if anything was said at all. But I know what I did the next morning, which is that I walked to the back room door, and I stood in front of it, and I put my hand on the handle, and I stood there for 5 minutes without moving. The door was not locked. I could feel in the handle's give that there was no lock engaged. Anyone could have opened it at any time. 400 people on the other side of an unlocked door. I didn't open it. I took my hand off the handle, and I went back to my cot, and I packed my bag. I left the shelter on day 35 alone. Early morning. I told Trish and Dean. Trish said, "Where will you go?" And I said north, because it was the only direction I'd heard named. Dean gave me a bottle of water and a can of beans he'd been saving. Mrs. Pack's paper cranes were still on the bleacher seats. Hundreds of them. I took one, folded it into my jacket pocket. Gerald saw me at the door. He didn't try to stop me. He said, "Stay on Lancaster Avenue. Avoid Fairmount Park. Don't travel after 3 p.m. Why 3 p.m.? That's when they're most active. We don't know why." I walked out into morning sunlight that was so bright it hurt. September was over. I didn't know what day it was exactly, but the trees had turned, orange and yellow. It was October, and the leaves were changing, and the air smelled like fall, like nothing had happened. Like the world outside the gym was just the world, clean and cool and silent. The silence was immense. No traffic, no planes, no human sounds, just birds, wind, my shoes on the sidewalk. I walked west on Lancaster Avenue, and I did not see a single person for 2 hours. I saw evidence of people, barricades made from cars, painted signs on buildings that said clear or gone north or do not enter. I saw a dog eating something in a parking lot, and I did not look at what it was eating. I saw buildings that had burned. I saw windows that were shattered inward, which meant something had gone through them from outside. I saw a school bus on its side in an intersection, all its windows intact, which was somehow worse than if they'd been broken. At midday, I found a gas station that had been fortified. The windows were boarded. The door was reinforced with plywood and screws, but it was open. Inside were canned goods, mostly taken, and behind the counter, taped to the register, a handwritten note on yellow paper that said, "Route 30 to Exton is clear as of 10/4. Group of 40 plus at the Exton Mall. They have power, God bless." I ate the beans Dean gave me. I drank half the water. I sat on the floor of that gas station, and I rested, and I thought about the back room and the phone and the unlocked door. Here's what I think now. Here's what I've come to believe. Months later, in the resettlement zone, with my 3 meals and my assigned cot and my intake interviews and my medication, I think some of the people in the back room were not turning. I think some of them were like Mrs. Pack, sick, scared, incoherent, but human, still fully human. And I think Gerald knew that, and I think he couldn't afford to distinguish between them. I think the architecture of survival he built required a clean binary, safe or unsafe, inside or outside, us or them, and the people in the back room were the cost of maintaining that binary, the tax, the sacrifice the structure demanded. And I think 400 people, including me, paid that tax willingly because the alternative was admitting that we couldn't tell the difference. And if we couldn't tell the difference, then the door between us and them meant nothing. And if the door meant nothing, then we were already inside the back room too. All of us, all along, the phone ringing. Someone in there had a phone, and someone called them. Someone out in the world called, a person we had put in a room and closed the door on. Someone who loved them called, and we heard it ring, and we said nothings because acknowledging the phone meant acknowledging the persons, and acknowledging the person meant the binary was false. I think about Keisha, whether North was real, whether she found the thing she went looking for. I think about the young man who had a nightmare and apologized and walked willingly into a room and was never seen again, and how his compliance made it feel okay. How his willingness was what allowed us to relax. I think about how many of us would have gone willingly if asked. How by day 21, the shelter had taught us that going willingly was the highest virtue. That not causing disruption was the proof of your humanity. That the most suspicious thing you could do was resist. I made it to Exton. The note was right. There was a group there. 40 became 100, became 300. Eventually, the National Guard arrived. Weeks later, they were organized and professional, and they asked us questions and gave us food and took us to the resettlement zone. And here I am. Here I am with my cot and my counselor and my intake forms and the medication they give me for sleep and the group sessions where we're supposed to talk about what happened. In group, they ask us to share. They use the word processing. They want us to process. I don't know what that word means in this context. I don't know how to process a gymnasium where 400 people agreed to something without ever saying it out loud. I don't know how to process that I watched a man get sick and said nothing. I don't know how to process the weight of the things I chose. Donna's name is on a list. There are lists now at the resettlement zone. Lists of confirmed dead, lists of missing, lists of unrecovered. Dana is on the unrecovered list, which means her body was not found in her apartment or within the search radius of her apartment, which means either she got out or she is something else now, walking with the wrong gait somewhere in the ruins of a city I used to live in. I check the list every day. The list updates every day. Her status does not change. My mother is alive. She was in Lancaster the whole time, well west of the event radius. She drove the resettlement zone when they allowed civilian travel again. She held me, and I felt nothing. Not nothing. I felt her. I felt her arms and her warmth and her familiar smell. But between me and the feeling of those things was a pane of glass that I cannot remove. Something in the shelter put it there. Something in the weeks between the departure board and the gas station installed a barrier between me and the experience of being held. And I don't know if it's coming down. Last week in group, a man, an older man, heavy-set, told his story. He'd been in a shelter too, in North Philadelphia, smaller than ours, a church basement. He said they had a back room too. He used those words, back room, without any prompting from me. He said 12 people went in during the 5 weeks he was there. He said 3 of them came back out. 3 came back out. I asked him after group, standing in the hallway with our paper cups of coffee. I said, the 3 who came back, were they? They were fine, he said. They were sick, and then they were fine, and they came back, and they were people. Regular people. And the other 9? He looked at his coffee. Some of them turned, some of them, I don't know, we don't know. The ones who ran things, they made the decisions. We just agreed, I said. Yeah, he nodded, we agreed. I carry Mrs. Pax Crane in my jacket pocket. It's flattened now, the paper soft from handling. The folds losing their crispness. I take it out sometimes and look at it and try to feel something proportional to what she deserved, and I can't. I can only feel the specific small thing I feel, which is, I should have said something sooner, not about the crane, about Curtis, about all of it. I should have spoken into the silence instead of letting the silence be the agreement. But I didn't, and the train left 20 minutes before, and I was not on it. And everything after was the world I got instead of the one I was supposed to have, and I live here now. In the world where the back room exists, where I know what I chose and what the choosing cost and who paid for my relief. The phone still rings sometimes, in my sleep. 3 rings, the default chime, and in the dream I answer it, and there's a voice on the other end, and the voice says, "Hello?" And it sounds like me, like my voice, like I'm the one in the room, calling out, and the person on the other end is trying to decide whether to acknowledge the ringing. I wake up at 2 a.m. every night. The medication doesn't touch it. The counselor says it will fade. The counselor says processing takes time. The counselor says I made the best decisions I could with the information I had. I don't think that's true. I think I made the decisions that were easiest to live with in the moment, and now I have to live with them in all the other moments. And those moments are longer and quieter, and there is no departure board to stare at, no crowd to move with, no current to carry me west. There is just me and the morning, and the list that doesn't change, and the crane, my pocket, and the sound of a phone that no one answers.